go. Okay, so usually I have someone to introduce. It's a little odd standing up here and doing this.
I can introduce you.
Let's go. I'm good. Thank you, though. So it was about maybe 10 years ago. I decided with my kids who were 5 and 8 at the time to build a tree house. Thought, let's give a tree house. So I put this board up about 12 feet high in the tree to kind of step back and see what it looked like, and it seemed like it was a good idea. So I go around the other side of the tree with a ladder, climb up there, and the ladder's right where I want to put that board. So I climb down, move the ladder, but forgot about my hammer. So it hits me in the head, and I got like blood dripping down both sides of my face. And my son, who's sitting on the grass over there, starts screaming, my head, my head. And I'm like, Ryan, it's my head. He's like, my head, my head. I was like, Ryan, it's my head. I was like, blood is literally dripping down my face. And he's screaming. So I said, Ryan, it's your foot. He goes, my foot, my foot. I mean, like, he knows someone's in pain. He doesn't even know it's him. He has Fragile X. And that's what I want to talk about. But like we normally start here, we start with how did I get to be where I am today. So here's a little short history. Again, my name's Les Kanat. It rhymes with planet. I grew up in Detroit, suburban Detroit, and I had a job at a grocery store for like 8 years. And I thought, like, I don't need to go to college. I had a great job at a grocery store. But just before the semester began at Wayne State University, I thought, okay, I'll go and major in photography because I've been doing photography. I have my own darkroom, and I'll just go to Wayne State University. So I went to Wayne State University in Detroit, and I found out through the general education program I needed to take a science lab course. So I took a geology course, and I really liked it. And I got an A. So I took another one, and I really liked it. And I got another A, and I said, okay, I'm going to get a Ph.D. in geology and teach geology at a university in the mountains by a large city. That was my goal. I knew that as an undergraduate in my second year. So I did the next couple of years, just did math, chemistry, and physics. Finally, after 5 years, I got my bachelor's degree in geology. I needed to get a master's degree, so I asked my, during my bachelor's degree, I was able to do some independent research. So as an undergraduate, I did undergraduate research, and it was up in Spitsbergen, which is north of northern Norway. So as an undergraduate, I went up to Spitsbergen to do some geological mapping, because I really like this idea of geology, which is the science that studies how Earth evolves, and includes weather, and it includes space, and it includes climate, and rocks, and volcanoes. It's a pretty big subject area. So I rode away to all these places to get a master's degree, and my advisor said, just stay here. You know, you could teach some classes, we'll pay your tuition, just stay here and do your master's degree. I thought, okay, why not? So for my master's degree, I went back up to Spitsbergen for a second time, and that was successful and pretty amazing to be up there. And while I was up there, while I was doing my master's degree, the University of Cambridge in England said, hey, we're aware of what you're doing. Why don't you come to Cambridge and do your PhD? I thought, well, why not, right? It's like, so went to Cambridge, got a PhD, and while I was there, of course, went back up to Spitsbergen to do some more research. And while in Cambridge, I also did some other geological mapping in some other places for some comparative reasons. I went to northern Italy and to the Saualp in Austria, and finished my PhD and came back to this country and got my first teaching job at the University of Texas. That was only a one-year position, so I needed to find another job. But while I was there, I did some research up in Alaska, and I was probably one of the few people who moved to Texas with a sweater and a jacket, and I worked in a cooler, so I was like the only one in Texas going to work with a sweater and a jacket every day, because for whatever reasons, whatever the research dealt with there. I couldn't find a job immediately, so I went back to Detroit, got a job at a computer corporation, teaching people how to use computers, and I got a call from someone here at Johnson, said, hey, we heard about you, we want you to come here. Came to Johnson, fell in love with the place immediately. So that's when it was Johnson State College. And since I've been here, I've been able to do some travel and do some research with other people in other places around the world, in Costa Rica and Bolivia, which is off the screen. And now we're Northern Vermont University, and I've been here for 30 years and been loved every minute of it. It's not quite a university in the mountains near a large city, but it's it's a college in the hills by a small town. It's been perfect. So that's my history here. Now we're a university. So about, I don't know when it was, let's just say 10 years ago, I had an opportunity to do a sabbatical, which means you don't have to teach for a semester. You still get most of your pay, and you can go off and do research. And I had this plan to do this research on geology. It was, I could tell you when it was. Ryan was 4, so it was 14 years ago. And I'm ready to go off and do this research on geology. He's diagnosed with Fragile X, and I'm so glad I didn't have to teach. There's no way I could have taught. I talked to the academic dean. He said, why don't you just do research? I suggested doing research on Fragile X, and he approved it, so I spent a lot of time just looking into Fragile X. So although I'm a geologist, I'm going to talk about biology. And what you've heard from many other speakers so far is that their path is pretty circuitous. So I started doing biology, and I talked to Dr. Dulce. I said, Dr. Dulce, I want to do bioinformatics. And she's like, okay, good luck. Because it's a big, steep learning curve. And I tried, and she's been a great guide and helped me with that. And I decided, you know what, I really like geology, and I'm not going to do bioinformatics. So I want to talk about Fragile X syndrome. Oh, we also do this class, you have to sign in. So on this clipboard, there's also a handout, one-page flyer about Fragile X if you're interested. So this talk is broken up into 3 areas. First, I'm going to describe Fragile X, like the medical basis of it. The second part is what it's like to live with Fragile X. And then the final part is activism, like what am I doing about it? So 3 parts. And I've made a lot of presentations about Fragile X, but I've never described the biology of it, because when you start talking about trinucleotide repeats to a general audience, they're like, okay, I'm done. But a lot of you are biology and geology and science. This is good. So first thing is, I'll get the mouse out of the way. Fragile X is a medical condition. It's a medical condition. It's like you can diagnose this with a blood test. It's also not just any old medical condition. It's a single gene disorder. One gene is responsible for Fragile X. The gene's called FMR1. And what genes do, genes make proteins. In this case, it makes FMRP if the gene works. FMR1 stands for Fragile Mental Retardation 1. It makes, when it works properly, fragile mental retardation protein. If it doesn't make that protein, you have full mutation Fragile X. There are 3 components to Fragile X syndrome. I'm only going to talk about the first one that's listed here, but I'm just going to mention the other 2, and they're on the handout. Fragile X syndrome is the most common cause of inherited intellectual disability. That means their cognitive delays are a result of the genes that they're getting. But Fragile X is also associated with what's we abbreviate it FAXPOI, which is Fragile X associated primary ovarian insufficiency, which is responsible for early menopause and hard time getting pregnant, and other problems. This is one gene is causing all this, one single gene. And then there's FAXTAS, or Fragile X tremor ataxia syndrome. It looks like Parkinson's. Do you know anyone with Parkinson's, anybody? So one person, so people who have Parkinson's often they often have a little tremor. But if you have Fragile X tremor ataxia syndrome, you only tremor when you reach for something. It's one of the subtle differences to, if you're not going to do a blood test, if you think you got Parkinson's, just kind of look when you're shaking. But we're only going to focus on the first one today. And it's also interesting that it's the Fragile X, when you have Fragile X, it is the only known medical cause for autism. So only 5% of those individuals with autism have it because of Fragile X. The other 95% have it because there are about 800 genes associated with autism we know about. Most of those genes interact with the Fragile X gene, which is some of that bioinformatics research that I decided to stay with geology. Let me just tell you a little bit about how you diagnose autism. Autism is a behavioral disorder. There's no blood test for autism. The DSM-5, here's the table of contents for the DSM-5. Maybe not. So the DSM-5 has all the behaviors that could be diagnosed by let me rephrase that. There are things like if you have anxiety, there's no blood test for anxiety. If you're bipolar, there's no blood test for being bipolar. If you have certain addictions or actions that are only determined by their behavior, they're determined in the DSM-5. And this looks like we have the examples of some of these disorders, behaviors, that are designated that way. And so let me just briefly so you could see, if I scroll through them, you might recognize autism, ADD, motor Tourette's, tics disorder, unspecified schizophrenia, catatonia, bipolar, all different bipolar disorder, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, all this obsessive compulsive disorders. You kind of get the idea that these are not, you can't get a blood test for these disorders. These are behaviors. So if you have insomnia disorder, it's not a blood test. If you have any sexual dysfunctions, that's the things are gender dysphoria. I mean, these are behavioral issues that are, there are a lot of them in the DSM-5. Fragile X is not in the DSM-5 because Fragile X is a medical disorder. It's a medical issue. So, what is the most significant difference between men and women? Anybody? Scream it out.
Chromosomes.
Exactly. Chromosomes. Okay? So if you're a male, generally, I mean, the science is not as cut and dry as like it's an X and a Y and two X are women. It's not that clear, but in general, men have an X and a Y. That makes men men, and women have two X's. And any biologists out there who study this, if you want to speak up and help me, at any time, I'm always open to suggestions. So this was the image that we sent in the Pioneer 10 space probe out into the far distant regions of the solar system to let people know this is what we look like on planet Earth. But the way, this is Fragile X, it's on the X chromosome. So the way it works, the way this is inherited, so for example, on this slide, if the male has the Fragile X gene on the X chromosome, for a couple to have a boy, the father has to pass the Y. For the couple to have a girl, the father has to pass an X. The woman doesn't have a choice. She's going to pass one of her two X's. So in this case, if the father was a carrier, the boys would be unaffected, but the women would be carriers. On the other hand, if the woman's a carrier, if she has one X that carries a Fragile X gene, that means she's a carrier or fully affected. Depending on which X is passed, you could have an affected son or an affected daughter. So in our case, I have a daughter named Marin. She was born just after Ryan was diagnosed. Like, stick out your wrist, girl, we're getting a blood sample. She got Laney's other X. And we have Ryan, who's what is called a full mutation Fragile X. What I find really amazing is 1 in 130 women carry this gene. That means what, on this campus, 4 or 5 women on this campus carry the Fragile X gene, statistically speaking. And on this handout here, it says that, in Vermont, we expect there to be 200 people with Fragile X and 2,900 carriers, just statistically speaking. Just people don't know about it. So back to how I learned biology. the human body is made of a bunch of organs. And if you look inside organs, organs are made of cells. And there are a whole bunch of things inside of cells, and what we're interested in are these chromosomes, which we find inside cells. Most cells, not all cells in the human body, not red blood cells, for example. That's why you could give blood and you're not giving away your genetic material. Is that correct? Thank you. So that's what the X, and I don't care about the Y. And when we look historically, evolutionary, the Y chromosome is getting smaller, and who knows what's happening to the Y chromosome in the human genome, but it's disappearing. But we're interested in the X today, one of the 23 pair of chromosomes that we have. And the reason why it's called Fragile X is when we image the X chromosome, we see that there's a little tail that looks like it's going to break off. Hence you say, oh, that X looks fragile. It's not like you have weak, fragile bones. It's just the gene itself. So the chromosomes themselves are made of DNA. And DNA is made of 4 components. And what we're interested in with Fragile X is just a couple of these things. Now, the chromosomes was just discovered recently in the 50s by a group of people at Cambridge. And the way it works is this: is that a gene is just a sequence of those letters. You just take that chromosome that's got a whole bunch of DNA in it, you chop it up into little pieces, and you name that a gene. And there are reasons where you stop to name it a gene. And then what the gene does some biochemistry and produces a protein. That's what genes do. Genes make proteins. And in this case, the FMR1 gene, which is the little piece of the X chromosome, the FMR1 gene, makes the FMRP when it's working properly. So back in 2003, we finally mapped the human genome, and we looked to see what are all these letters inside. If you put it in books, you'd have 23 books, the last set of X and Y books. And inside these books is just we don't really read it on paper. It's all done digitally. But when you look inside, all it is just a bunch of letters, a bunch of patterns. It's pretty boring reading, okay? But what we're looking for in Fragile X is we're looking for the CGG trinucleotide peak. CGG, that's what we're looking for. And we want to know how many repeats there are, because that's really critical for Fragile X. So again, the chromosomes, the genes are made of DNA, and we're just interested looking for this pattern of CGG. And if we could find that and count how many repeats there are, that tells us something about the individual who has Fragile X. So this variation is in the number of repeats is critical for how people respond. So in the case, this is what we call the Fragile X gene. Anyone know how many genes are in the human genome, roughly? A lot. 20 to 25,000 genes. Every year, we reduce that number. We used to think there were 100,000 genes. Now they're only 20 to 25,000. We're talking about one of those 25,000 that causes all these problems that we're dealing with. So that repeat number, when that repeat number is less than 40, you're considered neurotypical, meaning that you're not going to pass that on, you're fine. When that number gets above 200, the gene shuts off, the protein's not made, you have full mutation Fragile X. If you're between 50 and 200, every time you pass it to the next generation, that repeat number increases. So after we realized Ryan has Fragile X, we checked Lainey. She was in the high 100s. Her mother was in the low 100s. Okay, we didn't really go back any further. When males pass it, the number decreases. That's why if my son would ever get married and have a daughter, because he couldn't have, because if he had a son, the son would be neurotypical, would be normal, whatever normal means, neurotypical we like to use. If he had a daughter, the daughter would be a carrier, even though he's a full mutation, because the repeat number drops. Are we good with this? Questions? Okay, so when the gene is not producing the protein, it's like a light switch, man. That's it. That's it. It doesn't matter if the repeat number is 3,000 or 210. For some reason that geneticists would understand, 200 is the number that shuts that gene off. And that lack of that one gene does some really funny things to the brain. It affects different parts of the brain because of the way the brain is wired. I got a few images to share that with you. So here's, 60% of the people who have Fragile X have autistic spectrum disorders, and 25% of these individuals, or 20%, have seizures by the time they're 18. If they don't have them by the time they're 18 or 20, they probably won't have them. But it's pretty common in Fragile X. So because of the rewiring of the brain, these individuals are anxious, they have no short-term memory, they have no executive functioning, meaning it's hard to make a decision and follow through. They've got some physical issues, and it's all from this one gene. So this is what we call a dendrite. This is a neuron, and I mean, we can understand. It's not rocket science, right? We can figure this stuff out. It's only brain science. I can't figure this out, but other people can, okay? These genes, the FMRP, aren't working in these brain connections. When you want to have you want to make a memory, you got to connect the presynaptic from the postsynaptic dendrites, and you can make memories and do things and think logically. But when the brain is wired really poorly, it doesn't work. So on this diagram is an image of a dendrite, these little things in your brain that allow you to have memories and make connections and thoughts. And in a person with Fragile X, what you see is that they have these long dendritic spines and many more of them, and they're like, it's like going out of control. There are connections being made everywhere. Because if you had FMRP, it would prune those dendrites and you'd be neurotypical and typically developing. I look at it as a circuit box, because that I understand. Like, if I put one more wire in this circuit box, it's going to go kapooey, right? Whatever that means. Because this circuit box just is not wired properly. There we go. But we can't rewire the brain. Dr. Dulce.
If those spines could be eliminated, would the Fragile X disorder?
Right. So I don't think so. And the reason why is this slide here. There's a lot more going on than just the spines. Other questions right now? I'm open to questions here.
Could another of the 25,000 genes in the human genome, several are unused, or we haven't identified use for them? They're basically turned off. Is that accurate?
So the question was, are there a lot of genes that are turned off? I don't know.
Because this is a two-part question. If that's the case, could another gene be repurposed to produce FMRP?
So the question is, can you repurpose a gene? Can we? I don't think that's possible in the sense, unless we do CRISPR technology to start doing gene editing. Other than that, I don't think that's a solution.
Because I guess the question is, if the proteins existed, would the symptomology?
So the question is, if the proteins existed, will you still have the symptoms? No, we need the proteins. Other questions about this? So this was the first part of the talk, which is, what is Fragile X biologically? So once we get through a few questions, we're going to go like, what's it like to live with Fragile X? Go ahead. Please.
So on your pamphlet, so there's no cure for it yet.
Correct.
So I was wondering if they're working. They're working on cures?
That's
right?
the last part, the third part of my talk.
I was thinking, like, you know how you inject insulin in yourself? Could you like isolate the protein and like inject it to someone with Fragile X and like help them for a short period of time?
Don't know. That's not been done. There must be medical reasons why it completely doesn't make sense. And then you have to keep injecting the protein because it's not being made, so you kind of like walk around like a junkie. I don't know how that works, honestly.
So where's this?
There have to be other solutions. Another question, yeah.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth.
So, how did you guys find out that Ryan did have the Fragile X, knowing it could not be done through a test?
Right, so this is what it's like, when you see what it's like to live with Fragile X, the next talk you think, what's wrong with this kid of mine?
Yeah.
And then you start trying to figure out what it is. So when we first had him tested, the state said, oh, he's got autism. Then someone else said, well, he doesn't really have autism, but sort of autism-like. And we're like, we don't want a label of autism, so they labeled him as PDD-NOS, which is primary developmental delay not otherwise specified. We're like, we'll go with that. We're good with that one. And then we find he's got Fragile X. Like, damn, we wish we had autism. Okay, so so it's took years, took till he was 4 to figure it out, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. But we good? Okay, so what I'd like you to do, I need someone to help me here. Would you be my? Anyway, I'm going to I only need one person. Okay, so but I want you to sit next to someone because I want you all to try this. I want you to be in a group of 2, and one's going to be an assistant, and one is going to be the magician. So just turn to the person next to you if you want to do this, and this is what you have to do. So I'm going to both be the assistant. We'll both be the assistants here. So hands out in front of you. Seriously, come on, try this. It's really interesting. Thumbs up. You have to straighten your hands out. I don't know if I can do it in a sport car. I never wear a sport car. Okay, thumbs down. Cross your hands. No, come on. Bring it up like this. And now the magician, one of you, without pointing, say, move that finger. Wrong one. Okay, try that. Watch. Move that finger. This one here.
No, move this finger.
Move this one here.
Without touching.
Exactly. It's not like you do it.
Without touching it.
Only this one.
Oh, sorry. Oh, you can't touch it. You can't touch it. If you touch it, then the game doesn't work. You're just doing this just from, you're trying to make your brain connect with what you want to do. And how many people, of course you're going to do it. Okay, not all of you are going to do it, right? Yeah, because if you think about it, you really focus, you're going to do it. Because you can focus.
Kind of.
But now once you know, then it's no good anymore.
Oh my God! If you focus on that,
Again?
So that, anybody
Just moving the opposite thumb.
give them the wrong finger? Okay. It's pretty common, okay, to do that. But once you know and you start thinking about it because you have the ability to think, you'll be able to do this. So let me show you some other ways what it's like to live with Fragile X. The problem is, if you have Fragile X, it's really hard to make a plan because of the way the lack of this gene makes it really hard to come up with an idea and hold that idea in your head. It's called cognition. Plus, they're really bad at trying to sequence something. They have no ability to sequence, meaning that if I give you, Ryan, 4 sticks and I say make a square out of the 4 sticks, it wouldn't happen. If I had 4 sticks over here, they had a square, and I gave him these 4 sticks, say, hey, make a square, and he sees it there, he'll be able to do it. But there's no sequencing. That's really poor if it exists. No one-to-one correspondence. How many sticks are there? 2? Rye, 6? It's like, he might get it right. And they have weak muscle tone, which means really soft bowel movements. And because they have poor muscle tone, and they also have very poor hygiene, it's kind of hard to literally sit on the toilet and be in an appropriate position and try and wipe a place that you've never seen in your life. Look at this. This is amazing. This is by Hessel and others in 2017. I was at a conference. This is like a screenshot, like some of you take screenshots, so it's a screenshot. What I'm looking at here is plotting the average z-score, which is how many standard deviations away you are from the norm, versus different activities. So we're going to look at intellectual delay for unknown reasons, idiopathic intellectual delay. Like, okay, you're intellectual delay, we're not quite sure why, but you have some sort of ID. Down syndrome with intellectual delay, Fragile X syndrome with intellectual delay, and the general population norm. Now, the general population norm means that in all these measures, that's the norm. So let's look at the first one. Let's look at what is called cognitive flexibility. So the question here is, with cognitive flexibility, DCCS, notice that how easily can you adapt to new ideas, and how can you, that's kind of a good way to just adapt to new ideas and process information, or you're kind of like stuck on one path. Kids with Fragile X are 5 standard deviations below the norm. 5 standard deviations below the norm is really amazingly amazing. Flanker scores, attention and inhibitory control. Can you pay attention? Can you inhibit yourself from just like bouncing around doing things? Fragile X, 7.5 standard deviations below the population norm. This goes on and on. Picture vocabulary. 2.5 standard deviations below the norm. Can they read? Now, what I did with Ryan unknowingly, he never watched TV till he was 2, just because I thought TV's bad. But then when he had TV, we thought, okay, let's put on closed captioning. Just because when I would travel, I want to learn a new language, put on whatever language it is and see if you can learn a new language. Well, it's a language, not knowing he had Fragile X. He can recognize words. He's got no phonics abilities, but he can recognize words, so he can read. If he doesn't recognize the word, he says a word that looks like it, and he's got no ability to really make sense of the story, but at least he can read, which is kind of cool. For picture sequence memory, like put things in order, look at several standard deviations below the norm. Pattern comparison, list sorting. These kids with Fragile X have a challenge. Quickly, the difference between autism and autism caused by Fragile X. Now, this is a stereotype. We're all on spectrums of different things for just about everything. That's why we get different grades in classes. You know, you're on a spectrum of how well you can do in a class, or a spectrum of how anxious you are. So this is a stereotype of autism versus Fragile X. It's not a hard and fast, or this is the way it is. I'm not saying that all individuals with autism are socially indifferent, but many people who have autism, you know, aren't really interested in wanting to be social. But with Fragile X, these kids want to be social, but they can't because it's so anxiety producing. So they have social anxiety. They want to be social, but they can't. Gaze indifference versus gaze aversion. Like if I want you to do something and I look at you in your eyes, for many people, maybe not for Shane, you feel like a little more anxious, right? When someone's, so if I want Ryan to do something, I would not say, Ryan, I want you to do this. I would say, Ryan, I want you to do something, because he knows, these kids know, why increase your anxiety if you don't have to? Because they're already wired to the breaking point. These guys with Fragile X, they want to be friendly. Again, they just this fear flight response. It's hard to do that. Some people on this autism spectrum are really bright, great language. Kids with Fragile X, language delays. They really understand facial expressions really well. He'll tell you, he'll know from a distance if you're a safe person, if you're a happy person. And by definition, they have cognitive delays, but people on the spectrum can be super bright, right? This is a busy slide, so bear with me on this one. We're almost done with what it's like to live with Fragile X. The medical reason for their behavior is based on how their brain is wired. That's what the assertion statement is. Okay, the medical reason, the etiology of their behavior is rooted in, you know, how they're wired. And we know how they're wired because we've got lots of money to study this. So because of this, they are hyper-aroused really easily, and they're anxious. They have speech and language delays, which I've mentioned. They have gross and fine motor delays. Like the kid does not use a fork or a knife. It's just too hard. Sensory integration dysfunction. That's why he was able to sit on the grass and not move while I had the hammer drop on me, because he's not going to touch the grass. Like we could just put the kid down, he wouldn't go anywhere. ADD, low muscle tone, that's Fragile X. But because of that, that impacts their behaviors. If you've got to live with this, you're going to behave in a certain way. So they're impulsive, they're hyperactive, he's a great drummer. Couldn't keep up with the band, but he makes his own rhythm, and his own rhythm's good, but he wouldn't be part of a band because the band would be doing something else. And there's always this fear, fight, or flight response, because it's easier to not put yourself in a situation that makes you more anxious when you know when you're too anxious, you are hyper-aroused and it's all over. So because, because people act in certain ways, those around those individuals respond. What do? Like, how do you deal with these things? So what happens with Ryan and other individuals, they all look alike. These kids with Fragile X, they act alike. It's like, that could be my kid. Like when we hang out with other people with Fragile X, like, you know you're home. Like when we visit our family comes over, they don't understand Fragile X as much as those who are living with it. And these kids are all the same. But what happens, generally, once Ryan calms down He's like apologetic. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. He didn't have control. He couldn't take care of that himself. But the cycle goes over. It's all about hyperarousal and anxiety. If you can keep that anxiety low, keep him from getting hyperaroused, he's more receptive to language, he's more expressive with his language, he's calmer. And I say he, but I mean those with Fragile X, full mutation Fragile X. So because there's an overabundance of connections in the anxiety-producing part of the brain, and the brain chemistry system isn't working properly, over time throughout a day, these kids become more hyper-aroused. So we build in these breaks, like we just had a break. Stand up, take a break, focus again. A lot of classes that you have, take a break, focus again. If we don't, what happens, if he becomes overstimulated, it's over. It's like there he is on the ground, he's not going to move. He's now 18, I can't pick him up. So we build in these sensory breaks throughout the day. Many of us do that. Exercise. Mostly physical things. One of the major researchers in Fragile X said, you can't battle biology. So if you can't change who they are, then you got to figure out what do you do? Like, how do you live with them? And there's a lot of work on that. We have lots of information. I'm not going to share that today. Those are presentations for therapists and for doctors and for teachers and things like that. And as a matter of fact, we've had people move from Hyde Park to Jericho to send their kids to the Chittenden East School District because the teachers understand Fragile X in our school district because we've been working with them over the years. So people have moved into our neighborhood. So you got to figure out what's going on with these kids' brains if you're going to deal with it. That's part 3. So part 2 was living with Fragile X. Questions?
How successful are treatments dealing with symptomology, such as treatment like an anxiety disorder, or autistic spectrum disorder, or ADHD? So
The question was treatments. How successful are they? There are a lot of medications to treat symptoms, and everyone responds to medications differently. We found that his doctor, who happens to be at UC Davis in California, his doctor said, found that I found her because when I started doing research, she was the most cited person. I was like, okay, she's the most cited person in the research, she's my doctor. So she said that she found that a lot of her patients that she worked with Fragile X, who also happened to be taking minocycline because they had acne, were calmer. So we started a drug trial with minocycline, and minocycline works for some but not for others. And so it depends. The answer to your question is we have medications to treat the symptoms, but nothing to cure the problem yet.
Will Ryan have to live with you his whole life?
Will Ryan what?
Have to live with you his whole life?
Yeah, that's the question we've been asked ourselves since he's been diagnosed. I'm open to suggestions. It's not going to work. Go ahead.
So do you find the medications more helpful, or have you noticed any changes over time?
So the question is, are medications helpful? So what we want to do, so we try him on a medication, we say, is this medication working or something else changed? So we take him off the medication, he's like, acts like, it's like, okay, put him back on those, right? Then you start a new series of drugs, you run it for a year. Is it working? Take him off. Yeah, it's working. Or no difference, take him off. But we have lots of doctors and there's lots of research about this. And I'll tell you why there's so much research in the next part of the talk about being an activist and advocate to find out, like, how will we figure this out and what do you do next? So, I'm sorry, the question was, how do we know if the drugs work?
Yes.
You see changes in behaviors and blood chemistry and all sorts of tests that are going. There are lots of drug tests going on. A lot of them fail. Living with Fragile X, questions about that? Please.
How is your daughter with Ryan? they have a fairly good relationship.
Right. So Marin is 15, Ryan's 18. They're both in high school together this year. Ryan is, these kids with Fragile X are sweet as could be. They really are. So he'll do anything for Marin. Marin expects all of us to treat her like a queen, but only Ryan does that, okay? She'll say, I'm cold. He'll like, I'll get you a blanket, It's like, Ryan will say, I'm hot, give me a jacket. It's like, what? Okay, it's like, okay. So Marin just started high school at MMU. She's on the dance team. And this weekend, they said they had to bring in someone like, who do you really admire? And she said, Ryan. We're like, what? She goes, he's always happy. He always tries. I'd like to be as happy as he is all the time. So, yeah, really sweet. So they get along well because he does whatever she says, and she tells him what to do, and he's like, I'll do it. And if I need Ryan to do something, Mary will go, I got this one. Other questions about this? Yeah.
Sarah. Did it at all? Wow, this is a fragile question to ask.
Oh, good
Sorry.
point.
Did it at all change you and your wife's decision to continue having children? Were you already done with 2 when you found out that Ryan?
Okay, so the question is, how many children did Lainey and I want to have? So I'm happy to talk about these things. When I met Lainey, I was like, no children, maybe 1, none. Like none, maybe 1. She's like 2, maybe 3. I'm like none, maybe 1. And my whole life I've been none, maybe 1. But it's like, okay, 2 sounds good. If we would have known ahead of time that Lainey was a carrier, we wouldn't have had children. Because at that time, there was no way around it. Now you can do pre-implantation genetic screening. There are lots of things you can do now to make sure that the right X gets passed. It's just money. So, but at that time, 18 years ago, we couldn't do these things. So if we would have known, we got tested for things, it only makes sense. We never heard of Fragile X. Why would you test for something you never heard of? One of the things we advocate now is for individuals to, for doctors to test their patients for Fragile X, like all the time. One of the chemists that used to teach here, her name was Cynthia, she ended up moving to New York, and she met a man, got married, and she went to her obstetrician, and they just automatically tested her for Fragile X. Like the message is getting out. Yeah.
Rachel.
Rachel.
So, what's the difference, do you think, like for men and women, since we produce different chemicals, especially during for a woman to have Fragile X syndrome versus like a man, what would be the differences based off of like what our bodies naturally produce?
Right. So the question is the differences between men and women who carry Fragile X. So women have 2 X's. So the other X has what we call an activation ratio that might be enough just to produce enough protein to offset any of these other problems. So you don't even know, might not even know that you're a carrier because your other X is putting out enough protein to compensate for it. Guys only have 1 X. If it doesn't work, you're screwed. So what do you do about it? Like, who makes decisions? Where do you get money? What do you do? I'm a geologist, okay? I go to Washington, D.C. I'm going again next month. Come with me. But I only talk about Fragile X when I'm there. There were a couple times I also brought in the F-score program, but it's mostly just like I just focus on Fragile X. And I go to D.C. and I meet with my members of Congress and I tell them what I want. It's not just me. There are about 100 of us from around the nation that do this. We get everything we ask for. Everything. We get the laws changed. We get the money we want. Even in the recent administration, we're still getting what we want. So if you think that nothing happens in D.C., that's not my experience. I've been there enough, to D.C. enough, that I know the staffers in the members of Congress offices. And one of the staffers in Peter Welch's office called me up on Friday and said, Les, we want you to come to the airport on Monday at 11 o'clock to meet with Peter Welch to talk about prescription drug pricing. This week. I'm like, sorry, Peter, I got lab, I can't do that. So Lainey went, my wife went, okay, talked about prescription drug pricing. Peter Welch is introducing a bill at the House this week, named after Cummings, who just died, called the Lower Drugs Cost Now Act, HR number 3. And he needs some local stories. They exaggerate in the newspaper about our situation and the cost that we have. We have good medical insurance to the college. We still spend thousands of dollars a year in drugs, but we have good medical insurance here. Back in 2012, when we went to DC. I've been going there since he was 5, so 13 years now. And in 2012, we said, oh, the Department of Defense has $50 million to spend in 19 areas of medical research. I don't know why it's 50 million. I don't know why it's 19. I didn't care. I just said, not just me, all the advocates say, we want Fragile X to be one of those areas that can be funded through the Department of Defense. The next year that was approved. His doctor got a $2.4 million Department of Defense grant on top of her $21.3 million NIH grant to continue the research. This year, it's over $1 billion. That's a 20-fold increase in the amount of money, and only 2.5 times as many disorders are looked at. That's real money. So a few years ago, I became a grant reviewer for the Department of Defense medical research grants. I had to send in my resume. I had to apply for it. We had a long phone call, hours, and a lot about ethics, like what would you do if the doctors want to do this? How do you ethically feel about doing this, that, and the other? So I got that position. They know I'm not a biologist, right? I'm a geologist, and these are multi-million-dollar grants that go to the Department of Defense, and the people that you're either zooming in with or sitting at the table with are these great people who studied genetics and neurobiology and things that are well beyond dealing with rocks and minerals. They knew that when they brought me on. My daughter said, Dad, did you really just take another job you're not going to get paid for? It's like, yep.
Looks good on a resume.
No, it's not that it looks good on a resume. It is, I feel good when I learn something new and I can help someone. That's what I like to do. So far we've only got a couple $1 million out of the Department of Defense. But the National Institutes of Health, Centers for Disease Control, we've now secured $41 million annually from NIH and about $2 million from the CDC every year. That's coming in to research. How do we do that? You go and you talk to people and say, this is why it's important. This is what we need. If you ever want some good Chinese food, go to Joyce's Noodle House in Essex. They also have good fortune cookies. Life is about making some things happen, not waiting for something to happen. So I'm of the sort of mindset of learn about something. I like to learn new things all the time. Make a decision, which is a really hard thing to do, to take action. Because just learning about it isn't good enough. So you got to take some action. That's why I go to DC all the time. I think it makes a difference. So if there's a history of cognitive delays or autism in your family, even in your cousins, because you've got the same gene pool, then get tested for Fragile X. It's a simple blood test. It's also a cheek swab now, free cheek swabs out of Emory University. They'll send you a little Q-tip. You send it back to them. Takes longer, but a blood test, you got to get some blood drawn. That's more expensive. I want to show you this video. We have time. It's a 7-minute video. If you want to watch it later, just Google Yahoo Couric, Fragile X and Autism. Katie Couric is a well-known newscaster who interviews people from all over the world. And if I figure out how to make this thing have some sound.
The way we live today and how we'll live tomorrow. We begin with a look at the condition known as Fragile X. It's the leading known genetic cause of autism, with symptoms that can include learning disabilities, seizures, speech delays, and anxiety. Here's the story of one family raising a son with Fragile X and a doctor who's been trying to unlock the mystery of the syndrome for the last 3 decades.
He crawls into your heart, and he has a way of just touching you because he's so sensitive, and he has a good sense of humor, and those are on good days. People always say, children with special needs are born to special parents, and we say, no, children with special needs create special parents.
That's right.
Justin is 13. There was something a little bit different than the way he developed compared to our daughter.
When did you start noticing something might be wrong with Justin?
At an early age, he didn't crawl. He was trying to go directly to walking. It was as if he didn't want to put weight on his hands. He kept missing milestones that we finally had early intervention come in. Professionals who saw him would say, one would say, it's sort of like autism. And another one is like, he definitely does not have autism. He's too social.
When was Justin first diagnosed with Fragile X?
He was diagnosed just after his 5th birthday. When he was 4.5, he had a grand mal seizure that lasted 50 minutes. From there, we saw 4 different pediatric neurologists. Finally, we had a neurologist who tested for I don't know how many different disorders. The test comes back, and sure enough, he has Fragile X.
I reached out to my closest 10,000 friends. I said, hey, we just found out our son has Fragile X. What do we do? And we heard nothing. I finally got one response, and I said, hey, thank you so much for talking to me. What am I supposed to do? And he said, if I could tell you one thing, I'd tell you to go to see Dr. Hagerman at the Mind Institute.
What exactly is Fragile X syndrome?
Fragile X syndrome is a genetic disorder caused by a mutation in the Fragile X gene, and it leads to intellectual disabilities and autism. It's also the most common single gene cause of autism. About 2 to 6% of individuals with autism will turn out to have Fragile X syndrome as a cause of their autism. But 60% of those with Fragile X syndrome have an autism spectrum disorder.
I understand if you have Fragile X syndrome, a protein that is needed for brain development is not produced. Tell me how that affects the developing brain.
When you have Fragile X syndrome and you have what's called a full mutation in the Fragile X gene, the gene kind of shuts down and doesn't produce this Fragile X protein. Now, this protein is very important for brain development, not only in childhood, but it's important for brain development throughout life. It's the window for understanding autism. But now it seems like the Fragile X protein is so important for many different neuropsychiatric disorders, neurodegenerative disorders, and other neurodevelopmental disorders.
How do you determine if someone has Fragile X syndrome?
It's easy to detect. You do a blood test, and you ask for Fragile X DNA testing. It should be done anytime there is autism, anytime there is intellectual disability or mental retardation.
So a full mutation is present when there's somebody who has full-blown Fragile X syndrome.
Correct.
A pre-mutation is present in the carrier of someone with Fragile X syndrome.
The mothers of children with Fragile X syndrome are the carriers.
Do boys have this more often than girls?
Absolutely. Boys have only one X chromosome, and girls have 2 X chromosomes.
So if they have a mutated gene on one of their X's, the other X can compensate?
Absolutely, yeah. The other X can compensate.
When you found out, Sherry, you were a carrier, were you shocked?
Yes. You know, when you find out that you're the reason that your child that you're the cause of a developmental disability, I went into a depression. You know, it was genetic. It wasn't just an easy fix.
If you had known that you were a carrier of Fragile X, what were your options?
At the time that we conceived Justin, I'm not sure. Today, knowing I'm a carrier, you can do IVF. They test the eggs because half of my eggs are good and half of them are affected. Or you do donor eggs.
As we talk about awareness and we talk about the whole need for screening and just an understanding of whether or not you are or not a carrier, we recommend everybody get tested. It's an easy blood draw.
Why isn't it a routine test for pregnant women? I'm just curious.
I mean, the only thing that we've heard as parents is that, you know, there wasn't enough need for it. There wasn't enough awareness about it.
Once someone has been diagnosed, what can be done?
There are a number of different treatments for Fragile X syndrome. Very standard treatments like treating the anxiety or treating the hyperactivity or attentional problems, but there isn't a cure yet for Fragile X. There is the development of new targeted treatments that can reverse some of the abnormalities in the brain.
If this protein is so critically important and may be related to a whole host of diseases, why is there not more funding for Fragile X?
Because the people don't know about it.
Justin. Perfect, Justin.
What do you think is in Justin's future?
I guess it's going to depend on where the research goes. Dr. Hagerman told us at our first meeting, he will be able to live independently with supports. And I think that everyone has a talent, and Justin has a talent, and we will find out what that is, and we will help him bring out his talent in whatever he does for the rest of his life. You know, and you have to keep hope, because without hope, what's the point?
To learn more or to make a donation, visit the Fragile X Foundation at fragilex.org.
I've seen that thing 1,000 times. It still makes me tear up. That's his doctor. Those are our friends, Brian and Sherry. Brian and I have shared lots of single malt whiskeys together. There are 2 organizations that really do a lot of help with research and with parent education and education of teachers and therapists. There are also some of the greats in Fragile X research that I've learned from to be able to put this together. You just saw, I don't even have her name on here, but from the Mind Institute, Dr. Hagerman, I don't know why she's on there, she's like, was our son's doctor, knows a lot about it, but Karen Riley at Denver and Elizabeth Berry Kravitz, MD, Ph.D., they're just doing some fantastic research. Marcia Braden, this amazing psychiatrist, professional corporation, that's what those letters mean. So, and there's a group at Developmental FX, Mouse and Tracy, that really understand how to work with these kids and have been really helpful for all of us. So again, you know, just as a closing thought, as a take-home message, it's easy to get a test, and there's no reason not to. So, questions? Any questions? Yeah.
I noticed on your slide right there, it shows like a cheek swab.
Cheek swab, yeah.
So is it just, say like I was a pregnant woman, I could get a cheek swab, or would it have to be through blood to actually have them determined?
You could get just a cheek, you could take a cheek swab and they do DNA tests on the cheek swab, but you have to get the right Q-tip from Emory University. You should all do that. I mean, it's free. Something. I got a question. Here. No, let me tell you about the treehouse, okay? Right? No, about the treehouse. See, the treehouse. I might have a picture of the treehouse here. This was the treehouse. Okay? Treehouse was going to be 12 feet high. It was going to be hexagonal because squares are boring, right? Built so the tree can grow around it over the years. And there was a storm that hit just at that point. Took out about 150 trees in our backyard. Took out the treehouse. But that nice deck protected it from taking out the corner of our house. So it just punched a hole in the roof.
Did you end up keeping the hammer which was salted?
I still use it for other things. We made a deck. Finally, we made a deck with what my daughter calls a bazigo, but a gazebo, so it's much safer and no one's going to get hurt that way. Well, I don't know, whatever. You know, if there's metal stitches, if you ever have a chance to, staples. If you ever have a chance to get staples or string, I'd go for string if possible. They put staples in there. It was like really weird. Other questions? Anything, really? Nothing. Yes, please, Dr. Dulce.
Okay, in terms of schooling.
Schooling,
What kind of response did you get from Ryan's school, and did it change over time, and just what was that experience?
So the question is, what was schooling like for Ryan? So from preschool, we knew he had troubles. And we've always had what's called an IEP team. We've already had a group of teachers and staff members that have been fantastic throughout the entire time he's in school, and he's still in school. He's in high school now. 1 year, and they've come with us to some conferences in Connecticut. They've been receptive to learning about Fragile X. They'd never heard about it. It's easy to be scared by it, so you want to learn about it. His team's been great. When he was in 6th grade, the team said we should bring him some specialists from the Howard Center. They do this thing called ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis. And we're like, we don't think that's a good idea. This a bad sort of synonym for ABA is drill and kill, like just make them do it over and over and over again until they figure it out. Like, this does not work with kids with Fragile X. The Howard Center's like, we are professionals, we know what we're doing, we're gonna bring in 2 people from the Howard Center and we're gonna do this. Like, okay, fine, good luck, have fun, right? So it was a complete failure. And after about 6 months, they're like, okay. And they wouldn't even listen to what we had to offer to help them. And when they realized, oh, this isn't autism, this is Fragile X, it's different. We ended up running a workshop for 50 autism providers at the Howard Center to teach them what Fragile X is. And they're like, oh, I think I have a kid like that. It's like, you probably do. So the Chittenden East School District, they've been great. You know, and the reason why we said, sure, let's try ABA, because they got great ideas. And they're willing to learn. They've been more supportive than ever. And they, to this day, you know, we meet with them once a month, and it's always helpful. We also always bring food to those meetings. Right? 7:30 in the morning, teachers, staff, they're hungry. Lainey will make something. Once, when Lainey couldn't make it, I went on my own. I didn't feel like making anything the night before. I didn't bring any food. And I'm telling you, around the table, you could hear people's stomachs growl. And I said, I will not make this mistake again, because they were all expecting food, because we bring good food every time. So they've been great. By law, he can stay in high school until he's 21. So both my daughter and son will, I guess, graduate at the same time. And to follow up with your question, then what? Don't know. Ellen.
I'm curious about how much of your advocacy or activism is around education for the caregivers, for parents.
Right.
Because I have friends who experience very challenging kids, and it's not a pleasant scene, because I don't think there's this kind of a comprehension.
Right. So, I'm sorry, the question again is what?
How much of your advocacy or activism is around education of caregivers?
So the question is, how much do we go out and just teach others about this? This is the first time I've made this presentation at the college. Lainey presents at UVM to the nursing students and to the pre-med students probably 4 times a year. We have a lot of outreach efforts that are local for people call us up from all over. We are the Vermont chapter chairs, for the Vermont Community Support Network for the National Fragile X Foundation, so people get our names. Indeed, the family that moved from, I hand out these little business cards. Yeah, I give them out all the time, and I leave them out. I don't really leave them out, but one person got a hold of them. That's how they got a hold of us. Like, hey, I think I got an issue. It's like, yeah. So we try and do educational opportunities whenever we can. As I said, Lainey was just talking about Fragile X with Peter Welch on Monday, and if you Google Welch and Fragile X, it'll be in lots of newspapers, and all the TV stations were there. So whenever we can, that's why I spend a lot of time at Dr. Dulce at different conferences. She knows I'm always handing out cards. She sees. I thought like when we met with Dr. Forehand last week, and I was handing her a card, I thought Liz was going to like, oh my God, not again, right? She might have, right? No. It's the norm. So we do it all the time. It's our life. Yes?
Do you notice a difference in how the kids with this disability interact with each other?
Right. So the question is, when you put a bunch of kids with Fragile X together, what do? Usually, they don't play with each other because these kids don't play with each other. It doesn't matter if you have Fragile X or not. So it doesn't make a difference. He doesn't really have friends because he can't have a conversation. So, like at high school, he high-fives everyone. They all know his name. He knows everyone's name. But he's never said more than, what up, right? Or high five. So he's never been invited to a birthday party. But then again, kids with Fragile X hate birthday parties because all the attention's on them. Like, he's just like, we don't do birthday parties. It's why put him through things that he knows he's not going to like? So he doesn't really have friends. So when we have other families over whose kids have Fragile X, they do whatever they're going to do independently. Rachel.
I've seen people with autism react to animals, especially like horses.
Right.
So does he have the same kind of connection with animals?
So the question is, how do kids with Fragile X, or in this case Ryan, relate to animals? So let me give you a couple of quick stories. One is, we got him to go trick-or-treating once, okay? And you knock on some doors, and sometimes these dogs come barreling in at the front door, growling, drooling, teeth, and he's like, oh, they love me. It's like, no. So he has got there's no safety brain there. But what we have, since he's been 4 or 5, we started with hippotherapy, which means horse therapy. So you put these kids on a horse with someone leading the horse, one person on either side, so to grab him when he falls. And it's the most amazing sort of response that he gets from just hippotherapy. The first place closed down because of insurance reasons. The second place we went down closed down because of insurance reasons. They're not doable. So to this day, he talks about his horse Charlie. That was the name of the horse. And I would say it's been like 10 years since he's seen Charlie, and Ryan and I have guys' night out once a year. We go across the lake and sit in a hotel and eat burgers. And we happened to be driving by where we used to go for his hippotherapy, and he's like, let's go find Charlie. And Charlie was sold, he's long gone. It's like, okay, let's go find him. So we go to this stable, and we walk through the stable, and he can't find Charlie. So he sees a cat, and he goes up to the cat, and he says, have you seen Charlie? Where's Charlie? And the cat didn't respond. So he goes, I'm not kidding you. He goes to the horse like, have you seen Charlie? And Ryan's like, where's Charlie? And to this day, he's like, where's Charlie? And whenever he sees a horse, it's Charlie. So yeah, one thing, like what might he do? Maybe we can do something with horses or animals with aids and supports. He couldn't do it on his own. Question, yeah.
So I'm curious how, you said he has no safety zone, but you also said that the amygdala, in fight or flight, anxiety is always on. So how does that work, the contrast?
Oh, so when we go walking, I got my arm, I'm holding him tightly. Because, like, he would walk, like, he got thrown out of preschool because, like, he would walk in front of the swing, you know, like, people were like, don't you know you're not supposed to do that? There's no safety brain, but he still is afraid of things. Doesn't mean that he knows there's a cliff there not to go off. He doesn't know there's a cliff there, okay? But if he knew that he'd fall off, then he would kind of shy away from it, but he doesn't know. I mean, he knows there's a cliff. He's 18 now. He's had enough experience. It's not a degenerative disease. He's always going to learn more. He's always going to do better. He'll just kind of grows at about 60% of the rate of his typical age group. So he's always going to be delayed, but he'll always learn a little bit more. And he's as sweet as can be, and as fun as can be. You just can't go anywhere with him because it's too anxiety producing. Like if we go to if I wanted to bring him to an event here, we bring him in first. He'd be the first one here, he'd sit in the back, and then people would sort of come in slowly and that would be calm. But to walk into a place like this, he'd be out in a second. He wouldn't be able to do it. Sort of like the lobster in the pot problem if you were here for that presentation last year. Go ahead.
So my adult brother is autistic.
Okay.
And let's say some adult was tested and found that they have Fragile X.
Yep.
What sort of resources are available to them when they don't really have somebody to advocate for them?
Community support networks, these handout. Yeah, there are lots. And again, Fragile X and autism are different. Yeah. And there's a lot of money and a lot of support here. Go ahead.
You said you're going to Washington, D.C. again in February.
Yeah.
What's your goal for that?
So when we go to Washington, D.C., there are about 100 of us that go. The National Fragile X Foundation hires a company to make all the schedules for us and to give us what we call the leave behinds. So they tell us what our ask is. So the ask, I'm guessing, will be continue funding NIH, continue funding CDC. Probably there's an open drug label act. What we want the government to adopt is that for drugs that are already approved for a certain disorder, let's just try them for Fragile X if we think that it might work. It's called it's like a cross-label, it's an off-label sort of approach, which isn't allowed yet. So that'll probably be one of our asks. I don't know what they are yet. So when they tell me, that's what I'll ask for. Because you got to go with a common voice, and a lot of people say this is what we need, and they're like, okay, I'm hearing it. And it's amazing. Like there was one thing that we asked for. It took us about 5 years to get it, and Bernie Sanders always said no. Every time I go to no, we're not going to sign on to that. No, we're not going to sign on to that. And then he signs on to it, which is not Bernie's style. He says something, he sticks to what he says. He's pretty consistent. But the reason why he didn't want to sign on to it because it wasn't broad enough. It didn't incorporate enough people until it did, and then he signed on it.
Hi. So I know you said they have like a little bit, like he has a little bit of trouble with like speech. Does he use sign language more than actual verbal? And how is your communication with him with the sign language?
Right. So we taught the kids sign language early on as a way to do that. So my daughter knows sign language now. Ryan signs a little bit. He can talk now, so he's more verbal. But early on, he would sign. He still signs certain things. And with our daughter, we're like, when we're having dinner, like, don't talk with a mouthful. So she signs while she's eating now. But it's like, so yeah, we try and do that. Not that well. Okay, there's time for one more question, and then we can carry this on at dinner if you want to join me for dinner. Any last questions? I know it's time to go. Thank you for listening.